podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hey, it's me, your Uncle Cooper. Sorry to interrupt your music. I do love music, especially when it's set at a reasonable volume. You know, music is really only as good as your speakers. The same is true for minivans. A minivan is only as good as the tires it sits on. And the button on the screen there, it agrees with me. If you click on it, it'll bring you to all the Cooper minivan tires that'll make your minivan a really good minivan. Go with the Coopers! Cooper!
Welcome back to the Love Tennis Podcast with me, James Gray of iNews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. I've got Calvin Betton here, our tennis coach. I've got George Bellshaw here, our tennis writer. We're going to be talking all things tennis for the next hour or so. We've also got some special interviews, one with Dan Evans and one with a man who's making a film about tennis parents, and we'll talk a bit more about that, as well as talking to Cosman about the film that he is trying to get made and how you can get involved in making that film. More on that later. We're also going to talk about Simona Halep. She's been suspended for a doping charge. We'll talk about Dan Evans and his explosive comments this week to me about wanting to play doubles in Davis Cup. There's titles for Felix Auger-Aliassime. There's one for Jessica Pegula. There's one for Lorenzo Musetti, Holger, Rune. Absolutely packed 7 days of tennis, and we'll probably run out of time, but we'll do our best to get through everything that we can. George, I have to say to you, first of all, good evening.
Yes, I'm in a far cheerier mood than I was compared to the last time we spoke when I was... actually, was it 2 weeks ago when I was sitting here watching us struggle to...
For context, George's mood is mostly dictated by the fact that he's an Aston Villa fan and therefore most of the time quite miserable.
Yes, but not anymore because Unai Emery is about to turn it all around. I'm excited. I'm very happy.
Calvin, you're a Man United fan. I suppose that makes you reasonably happy by comparison to some recent times at the moment.
Yeah, very happy. We're looking like a team again, and most importantly, we're enjoyable to watch. I'm looking forward to watching the matches again rather than thinking it's something that I have to do twice a week.
I always think, with tennis fans compared to football fans, that if you're a tennis fan, very few people, because I asked this on Twitter, if you're a genuine like Djokovic stan or Federer stan, what are you going to do when they retire? And most people's reply was, well, I sort of have a stable of 5 or 6 players who I watch. So if you really don't like watching so-and-so in the current mood that they're in, you can just go and watch a different player. But yeah, with football, you don't get that choice.
Can I just ask something? Because I hear this all the time. I'm going to sound really like old and like farty here, but like, what does stan mean?
The fan, I guess. I mean,
why not? Why is it not just fan then?
I don't know. I honestly, I'm kind of embarrassed that I used the word myself at the age of 31.
I see it all the time though, and I never really know what it means.
I think I did once know the origin. George, you're the youngest.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, fractionally. I don't know the origins, but I suppose the difference between fan and stan on paper, but like, is just the way you can use stan as a verb. Like, I stan this person rather than I fan this person. That's not a quite a transferable. That's often how you use the word. So it's taken fan to verb form. But I'm sure there is some exciting origin somewhere. But I did inquire after it in my days of the Metro Sports desk with the entertainment desk who used it all the time, and they couldn't offer me anything either. So maybe it's just been lost in translation.
Is it too mean for me to say not the first time the Metro Entertainment desk has failed to offer anything of note?
I'm fairly sure they don't listen to this podcast, but I'm not going to comment on that.
Oh dear. Well, we better move on. Speaking of rival publications, we've got a review this week, and as you know, if you leave us a 5-star review, whether on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, where I think you can leave a written review these days, I will always read it out. Got one here from Stuart Fraser. Now, I don't know whether that is the Stuart Fraser of Times tennis correspondent fame. It is a relatively common name. Either way, he says, good stuff, 5 stars. Enjoy the podcast. A good listen every week. Cheers, guys. A man of few words, so it may well be Stu Fraser. But thanks very much for leaving us the review, Stu, and hope you keep listening and enjoying it. Same to all of you out there, make sure you leave us a review or tell your friends to start listening, or preferably both. Makes a massive difference. Means we can reach more people, means we can do more podcasts at the very base of it. Probably the best place to start this week, if we get into the meat of tennis, is with Simona Halep. The news broke last week that she had failed a doping test for a blood booster, I think is the best way of describing it. It's called roxadustat. It's an anti-anemia drug which stimulates the production of red blood cells in the body. I read a report about it that says it basically makes you produce EPO, so it's almost like a new version of EPO. She's been provisionally suspended from tennis after testing positive for the substance, both A and B sample, and she says she has not cheated. She says, "Today begins the hardest match of my life, a fight for the truth. Throughout my whole career, the idea of cheating never even crossed my mind once, as it is totally against all the values I've been educated with. Facing such an unfair situation, I feel completely confused and betrayed." She says she would fight until the end and that she tested in an extremely low quantity. There's been lots of players coming out in support of her, saying that they'll stand by her. Her former coach Darren Cahill wrote a very long piece on his social media. Patrick Mouratoglou, who of course was coaching her recently, has also said that he'll support her throughout. But she now faces the charge of testing positive for a banned substance. George, she now has to prove that there is a good reason that was in her bloodstream, that there is, it was there. This is strict liability stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be. She won't be playing anytime soon. It's never a particularly quick process, one way or the other. You would say, kind of recent history suggests there are ways for these bans to be overturned. I have to say that the thing that really I was thinking about this week when I saw this story was, obviously it's the biggest player in tennis since Sharapova. But I was kind of thinking from the Sharapova perspective, it's been a while since like an athlete's actually been kind of tested positive and just said, yeah, I did do this. I know the Sharapova one, it was a slightly different case, but I was just thinking that, has there ever been a case since Sharapova where an athlete's actually gone, yeah, I did accidentally kind of take this thing, blah, blah, blah.
I was just thinking about CJ Auger, who's the British sprinter, but I think he was cleared of deliberately taking it. So, no, not that I can think of. Calvin, you think of anyone?
There was the doubles. I always forget whether it was Cabal and Farah who basically acknowledged that he'd had it, but it was from some contaminated beef.
Yeah. Which is
I think it was proven that it was such a small amount. I don't think that it must have been from what he'd eaten, I think, in that instance.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's only really so much we can talk about the case specifically because it is ongoing. But to talk about doping in general terms, you're right, George, in that, the way this process now works, because I spoke to the ITIA, who people probably don't know, it's the International Tennis Integrity Agency, and they kind of coordinate all of this. And I had a sort of long chat with them on Friday, and basically, if you plead guilty, so to speak, they do the ban and then you move on. If you plead not guilty, you're then required to put together your evidence, explain how it was there, and it's kind of a long process and it goes to an independent body. You can then appeal, and then you usually end up in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Now, CAS, as most people might know it. I have a couple of quite good contacts at CAS, and I have spoken to people at length about doping and CAS because they're the big cases that end up there. And, it really, you just want to get the right people. If you get the right panel at CAS, you can see the pattern of athletes getting generous judgments. What I should also explain about CAS, and what I always say about it, is their business model is to keep everyone happy. If you want to be, the court of last resort, the best way to make sure that sports keep, putting you in their legislation is by making sure that everyone gets a piece of the pie. So if you're an athlete, I'll come to you in a second, George. If you're an athlete and you get a ban, and if I was advising you, and this is me with zero legal expertise, I would say, if we can afford it, let's go to CAS, because I virtually guarantee you'll get your ban reduced. They'll say, like with Sharapova, they'll say, you're not a cheat, but you did test positive, so we still have to ban you, and we'll just knock 6 months off. And then everybody's happy. The governing body look like they're enforcing anti-doping regs. The player gets the "I'm not a cheat" thing, and gets their ban reduced. Everybody's happy. George.
I was actually going to ask you a further question, James, because you've obviously been a lot more engaged with this kind of writing about it stuff this week. But can you tell us a little bit about the drug for those who don't know it, from what you've kind of been writing about it, and why would it be a benefit to them as well?
Yeah, so roxadustat is, as I say, it's an anti-anemia drug. So people take it if they've essentially got a low red blood cell count. Now, red blood cells obviously carry oxygen. They have hemoglobin in them, I think, and oxygen attaches it to it. So if you have more red blood cells, you can take up oxygen quicker and essentially both recover quicker is the main thing. It also means that you can, in theory, increase your physical output, if that makes sense. The reason I likened it to EPO is because in one of the papers I read, it basically says that it naturally stimulates production of EPO. People who don't know what that is, it was huge in cycling. When cycling was essentially a doping sport, people talked about in the Tour de France there being two pelotons. You had the guys who were using doping and the guys who weren't. Basically by about the middle of the second week, everyone else is knackered, and the guys on EPO, which I believe stands for erythropoietin, and it allows you to increase the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood, get more red blood cells in it. So the reasons for using it are pretty obvious, I think, from a physiological perspective. I'm sure that we will find out where else you come across roxadustat and what it, how it could get into your system. I've absolutely Simona Halep says she's innocent and that she doesn't know how it's got into her system. Presumably there is some way it has got into her system. I don't know whether, what that is, and we won't know for quite some time. But that's what roxadustat is and what it does and why you'd use it for doping. And she has tested positive for that. So that's all we know at the moment. Are you looking to source some, George?
No, I was reflecting. It'll be interesting to see. It's always interesting when these things happen to hear, because you have to build a positive case about why it's there, really, don't you? You have to come up with that explanation, and that will be interesting. It also kind of makes me think a bit about the theory of why athletes train at altitude is obviously to kind of alter their hemoglobin complexion to make it take on oxygen at kind of worse oxygenated air capacity, so that when you bring it back down, so the theory kind of continues with that. If you're adding more red blood cells, more hemoglobin, take more oxygen, blah blah blah. So good times. If you're not caught, of course.
Yeah, well, quite. I've just watched Icarus as well, which is a fantastic film that is on Netflix in the UK about the Russian doping drama, which is brilliant. On a side note, Calvin.
On that, if anybody, I don't know if any of our listeners are interested in knowing more about, I guess, specifically EPO, but doping in sport and the mentality of it and how it works. The book called The Secret Race, which is about one of Lance Armstrong's teammates, wrote a few years ago, and it's absolutely fascinating. And not in a good way or a bad way, but it makes you see things in a different way than what you may do otherwise. You're right about the Court of Arbitration for Sport, James. They're getting to the point where they're just absolutely pointless in that regard. Their peak came when, wasn't tennis, of course, when they let Man City off a ban from the Champions League if they paid them even more money. And the ban was for spending too much money. So it's known within sport now that, like you say, that if you can get it there, they'll basically always side in the favour of the athlete or the team as opposed to the governing body. And they'll basically just... And that is indicative. They'll basically say you can stick an extra fine on it and the governing body will benefit financially from it and get the kudos from it. So that's basically what happens.
Yes, it's a bit of a mess. I wanted to ask you just something specific, Calvin, about doping and tennis. In that, what will probably come up here, because it very often does in these types of cases where an athlete does test positive and says, I didn't take it deliberately. is the fact that athletes have to be so careful and stringent about what they take. I mean, you must have it even with your guys, because they will occasionally have to go through anti-doping. I'm sure that if they were taking a protein powder or, a vitamin C tablet, they would go through it and check it and go to the website and make sure it had to have anything on the banned list, right?
Yeah, there's a list. There's not necessarily. I mean, most of the sort of protein powders and that kind of thing, the supplements will say that they're cleared of all that. They'll put it in the bump that they're cleared of anything that would get them into trouble. I guess the problem is if that's not the case, if they've something snuck in there, or if they've got a bad batch or something like that. Someone was asking me about Halep the other day, and I think we're now past the age of past the age of where athletes knowingly dope, because there'd be no logic to them doing it. They are going to get tested. They know they're going to get tested, so you'd be stupid to do it because they're getting tested with such regularity now. The problem then comes, and I don't really know a way out of this, but they all, with the increase of sports scientists around and nutritionists and that kind of thing, as I've said before on this podcast, there might be some things that currently are legal that won't be legal in 6 months or a year. And then it comes down to the debate. And again, we reach this, that book I just mentioned talks about this. Are you morally then okay doing it? If somebody says to an athlete that there's this thing that will improve you, it's legal. It won't be legal a year from now, but by the time that comes round, you'll have stopped taking it, and there'll be something new out by then. And I do think there's a lot of that goes around. Look, there's relatively few people in tennis who get caught doping, but we'd be stupid to think in any sport that cheating doesn't go on. People in life cheat. So in football and tennis, where we don't get so many positive tests, it's probably just because it's getting masked a bit better.
Yeah. And of course, if you could boil the Sharapova case down to that in many ways. She was using a drug that was giving her more of an advantage, then just obviously didn't realise it was on the ban list, so she says. But that was the same thing. It was, you can gain your advantage until they kind of start putting stuff on the regulated list.
I think the Sharapova thing was, what stands out for me about that was that she'd said that she was taking it for some heart condition, but every sort of medical thing that was referenced on that said that if you were taking it for a heart condition, it was only effective for the first 6 weeks of taking it. And I think she'd had it in her system for something like 7 years. So I think that probably wasn't right. I always find it interesting when these things happen, because everyone, and I'm not for a minute saying that Simona Halep has been knowingly cheating or that kind of thing, but we get the same thing that always comes up. They always say they're going to fight it. They don't know how it's happened. And then the coaches and the ex-coaches come out and say, that's definitely not the case. And it's like you said, George, no one ever admits that they've done it. And it's always somebody else's fault. But it's a difficult thing, I suppose.
It is a difficult thing, and it's kind of awkward legal ground as well. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this one plays out. I thought briefly it might affect WTA Finals, but obviously Simona Halep has ended her season after the US Open. She had that surgery on her nose, which was both a kind of wind surgery, but also a cosmetic nose surgery. She says, I suspect, and I know that she will have known by then that she had this positive test. So, there's kind of a bit of boxing clever there, thinking I'm going to be banned for a few months at least while I fight it, so I might as well have this surgery. Anyway, we shall see how that evolves. Moving on, and when it's difficult when you go. Sorry, Calvin.
Just quickly, I'll say, James, tennis players have quite a good record of people forgetting. Actually, like there's certain athletes that are done for doping, and we always remember it. Whereas tennis players, if you were to try and list sort of 3 tennis players who've tested positive more than 2 years ago, you probably couldn't. And there are a few.
I can do a few.
Okay, go on.
I can do Cilic. Gasquet.
Everyone forgets the Cilic case. I had completely forgotten that as well.
Cilic, Gasquet, Sharapova.
Gasquet was innocent, George. He was just snogging a girl who had been eating cocaine.
They still. Your question was.
Let's get
your
that
question.
straight.
Your question was who has tested positive. I didn't assign guilt to anyone.
He cleared that up at the time. He was kissing a girl who'd been eating cocaine. Let's get that straight.
On happier subject, I was out, as we mentioned last week, I was out in Antwerp and I spoke to a few different people, including Dan, and we had quite a good little chat, actually. We talked about lots of things, but I started by asking him about his thoughts on Britain's recent Davis Cup defeat in the group stages up in Glasgow.
I think we fell into a trap of, and this is meaning in the nicest possible way to the doubles guys, there's nothing against them, I don't need to play doubles on the tour to prove how good I am at doubles. When I do, I normally do okay. I think we need to look past doubles rankings for a Davis Cup tie, and if a game style fits or game style doesn't, then maybe we should be picking other people. And yeah, of course I would like to have played. I wasn't asked to have been played. I've been asked it a lot on social media and stuff, and by a lot of people, that why didn't I put myself forward to play, and that wasn't the case. I was never asked to play and didn't get given the chance, and yeah, listen, it's fucking annoying, it's disappointing, it's a bit, to be frank, it's a bit insulting also that I haven't been picked ever to play Davis Cup.
Is that right? You've never played doubles?
Never played doubles, and I can't keep asking the same question, and
So you've had that conversation with Leon. You've said, "I think I'm good enough." Why, or have you not?
I had the conversation in Austria. I played with Neil before for a year to try and play Davis Cup, didn't get picked. Changed the team there. Neil and Joe played, and I'm at odds to why I've never played, and it's frustrating, as I said, a bit insulting as well, I think, and it's something I have to think about going forward. To if I want to put myself in that position again, to keep going there, and we're not getting the right results, so maybe I should have a conversation and sit down, and if he wants to go a different way, then it's entirely up to him. He's the captain, and it's disappointing, and mainly it's for the team. I don't want to play for myself. I want to play because I think that's the best for the team, but as I said, I'm not the captain. And that's the answer to your question is I wanted to play and I just wasn't picked.
And it must have stung a lot, just that whole tie. I mean, I know you love Davis Cup. I saw the video of you running up and down the stands. I mean,
and that's the thing. I don't want to. The whole thing with Davis Cup is I just want the country to do good. It's passion for us as a country to do well. It's not. Yeah. It's not this singles versus doubles thing. I just want the best team on the court, and it's not. The last few times it's been hard to be sat there on the side thinking I think I'm a better option, and that's my opinion obviously, but it's never been offered to me to play, and that may be something I'll regret till the day's done.
How do you rate your season overall? Like, we're coming to the end of the year, how do you think your year's been? I think you're almost the exact same ranking now as you were this time last year by coincidence, but
it's been a good season. I don't rate my season so much on wins and losses. It's been really enjoyable. It's been another year which I can't look back and say. Obviously there's been shit times. Fucking last week in Tokyo, losing from that point, but there's way worse things out there. There's way worse things to be doing. It's been another amazing year. On the whole, loved every minute of it, and it's I'm ranked where I need to be in the big tournaments, and of course I'd like to be ranked higher and win more matches, but think that you start thinking about that, there's added stresses, and maybe you stop enjoying it as much, and it's a hell of a lot of better place than I was 4 or 5 years ago at this time of year.
Dan Evans there talking to me at the ATP event in Antwerp last week, where he was eventually knocked out by Felix Auger-Aliassime. Calvin, listening to that, you obviously know Evo well, and we always know he's got strong views, and he's entitled to them. What do you kind of make of what he said there?
I think he's got some valid points. And I'm not sure whether we're thinking about this in a broader range or a specific one, in terms of that we should ignore the doubles players and not play the doubles players, or do we look at it that Dan Evans should be playing doubles? And I think both of those, or one of those, is right. Dan Evans, specifically because Dan Evans is a very good doubles player, there's an argument, a very strong argument, that he should have at least have played doubles once. But he maybe should have played in the last weekend a couple of weeks ago, or the last week when we were playing that. I don't see an argument that you don't pick doubles players. Say if Evo wasn't in, and then your squad was, say, Murray, Draper, Norrie. I don't know who's after that, because I don't think any of those would be able to compete on a doubles court with the best teams in the world. Whereas Evo, as we've seen through the last couple of seasons when he plays doubles, is a very competent doubles player at the highest level. So I would argue that doubles players definitely should be included in the squad, being that we have some very strong doubles players. They should feature in the matches, but also Dan Evans is a very, very good doubles player, and he should have featured at some stage.
George, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's kind of hard to disagree with. I mean, I really enjoyed the interview and the conversation and the debate. I mean, I feel a bit sorry for the guys who did play, because they were obviously quite tight matches, and it came down to a few points here or there, as many doubles matches do. So I wouldn't say they necessarily went out and did a bad job. But Calvin's right. Evo's proven himself to be a good doubles player and a guy who can bring it at the top level of doubles. If anyone was maybe going to be questioned who you'd be playing at the minute, you could be looking at Murray though, as much as the doubles guys. Is he playing well enough broadly to necessarily kind of hammer home that inclusion? I know in Glasgow it's a bit different, but there's always questions, and I guess this is Leon Smith's poison chalice, as he's got a lot of options at the minute. But it seems Evo should deserve a go at some point, I'd have said.
I think there's also a few layers to this as well. Like, for example, that we do have the number one ranked doubles player in the world in Joe Salisbury. But also, at the same time, Joe wasn't and isn't currently at his full fitness. He's got a back injury that's affecting his serve and that kind of thing. So, but then imagine if they hadn't have played Joe and hadn't won those matches. And then you've got the number one doubles player in the world playing there. So I think that's where it brings up a certain level of difficulty. And and Evo is a particular case in that he the way he plays and the way he volleys suits doubles. He's very skillful. He's very handsy with his volleys. He can move the ball in different directions late, which is what you want in doubles. Murray is an excellent volleyer, but he's more a technical volleyer. He's definitely more of a singles volleyer. His serve and his return aren't a problem. I think what's a problem with Murray on the doubles court is when he's serve as partner or return as partner, and when he's got volleys, because he wasn't putting them away. But and the last thing on it, and I've said it again, I see it as, and I keep saying this, I see the doubles players and the singles players as not one's better than the other. They're just in different forms of the game. And I always liken it to cricket in that you have specified, you have certain players who can play both, or all three, Test cricket, one days, 2020s, and you have certain players who only play one, and they're picked for those matches for that reason. And it's generally regarded that I suppose the Test players are the singles players, in inverted commas. They're seen as the purest, the best players. But then if you're in a 2020 World Cup, you wouldn't select the Test team, would you?
Exactly.
And that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think we've not really heard from the doubles guys kind of come back on this, because I imagine it's gone down pretty poorly. Evo is playing doubles in Vienna this week with John Peers. Would you like to know who he's got in the first round? Joe Salisbury and Rajiv Ram.
Salisbury.
I would quite like to perhaps book a late flight to Vienna for Wednesday.
Not so much just about Evo's comments, but I think it will be interesting off the back of this and kind of results over the last few years, really, whether people do start looking at Leon Smith now we've actually got this strength and depth. I know people will probably did quite well at the Davis Cup finals a few years ago, and that the kind of pre-COVID ones where they got to the semis there and lost to Spain, but they beat Zverev, Germany, basically winning singles, Netherlands and Kazakhstan. He's just gone out this time to a group with the Netherlands and Kazakhstan in.
Yeah, how do we keep drawing the Netherlands and Kazakhstan? I feel like they're the only people we play.
I think something else that's a bit odd with the doubles as well is that we have all these players who are in the top 100, and there may be one who I coach who's there very soon because he's currently ranked 101, which I thought today might be the day, but wasn't. But then none of them actually play together. And although in theory there's a double system, and I know this is something that Louis has tried to fortify for some time, there's a double system so they all know it, and so you can slot them together effortlessly. That actually hasn't happened yet. And I do think it helps if you've got a team who have played together sometimes and they know what they're doing. Now, what Evo is particularly good at, because he tends to play with a range of partners, is slotting in with different partners. So that might also be something to consider. He also receives from both sides. He can do add and juice. And he's very, like I say, he's very good at adapting to different partners, which, as we've seen in key ties over the last few years, whether it be an ATP Cup or Davis Cup, the other doubles players aren't all that great at that, because our doubles record in team competition compared to how good a nation we are at doubles isn't great.
No, and that really is what has let us down in the last 2 years. I mean, you can always argue, well, if the two singles lads win their ties, it doesn't matter. But we have lost a number of decisive doubles ties against pairs who often play with each other. You know, the German guys, they often play with each other, and I think they might be unbeaten in about 11 Davis Cup matches. That German pair of Kravitz and is it Putz or Mies? I always forget. George.
I was just saying, you know, if Draper can continue on the trajectory he's on as well, you know, in theory we could have actually a decent. Not that Norrie isn't a decent top ranked player, but he isn't a top ranked player you'd back against top players. But Draper feels to me like he could potentially get into that Murray mold of taking on the biggest guys in the world in a couple of years' time. So, you know, I think we need to see better results soon, to be honest. And I'm hoping they're around the corner, and getting some doubles wins would certainly help in that front.
Well, here's the question. Sorry, Calvin, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say, do you think that we'd ever get to a point where Andy Murray doesn't get selected?
Well, that's what I was kind of going to tee up. I think it's close.
We should be close to that, shouldn't we? I mean, unless Evo's going to just sack himself off from the squad forever.
Well, I mean, that to be fair,
after James's interview and cut his ties.
Like that is what he was kind of alluding to. Like, I don't know whether he'd do it, and you know that Evo is a bit like that sometimes, where he does say things and his opinion might change, but if he does, and there's also an opportunity, or an argument I should say, that he doesn't get picked. Like, Draper's not far off. It was funny in the US, everyone was getting very excited about Draper, obviously, and it was put to Evans, and it was like, you know, a lot of competition for places, aren't there? I think actually the question was phrased in such a way was that you can't not pick him, right? And Evo was like, oh, hang on, like he's won a few matches and he's a very good player, but and I think he was quite affronted by the idea they might pick Draper ahead of him. But like, you know, in 6 months' time, it wouldn't be surprising if Draper was ranked above Dan Evans and had some bigger results. And, you know, he's literally on court with Carlos Alcaraz in a deciding set right now. You know, I don't know if Evans has played Alcaraz this year, but anyway, it's not really a fair thing to compare. But
he's the only one I would actually back to have a chance of beating Alcaraz at the minute
for
our top players.
For example. So yeah, there's definitely change afoot. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. I mean, just if you didn't have Murray and you didn't have Evans, because Murray, let's say, is done, and let's say Evans walks away. I mean, who would be the third singles player, Calvin? Like, who do you think they'd go for?
I mean, I guess it'd be Brody, wouldn't it?
Well, I suppose so. I mean, Peniston's actually ranked above him.
Yeah.
But
it's a bit of a weird one, that, though. And I'm not. They're both friends of mine, Penno and Broads, and I think it's weird how they've worked in that Broads didn't get certain wild cards in the summer, and the argument was that Penno had a better year, and Broads' counter argument could have been, but he's been playing the main tour, and Penno was playing the Challengers. And if you'd have reversed it, then Broads would have been winning matches at Challengers, and Penno might have struggled on the main tour. And I don't think there's really not much in between them. And they also both play very similar. They're both left-handed players who make you play a lot of balls. So there's not much in that at all. I mean, realistically, like, the third singles player rarely ever gets a look in anyway at these Davis Cup things.
I mean, let's not forget there is a forgotten man of Kyle Edmund, of course. You know, if we're talking about Britain's strength in 2 years, if he could come anywhere near the level he was before, that maybe seems questionable at the minute, given how long he's been out with this knee injury. But that would be pretty good if he could get back anywhere close to what he was playing at when he was at the top of his game. Norrie and Draper, you could be talking about 3 top 20 Brits there potentially. I think that may be a way off for Edmund, admittedly, at the moment, but there's a lot going on in British tennis. I think it's an exciting time in many ways.
Welcome back to the Love Tennis podcast with me, James Gray of the iNewspaper and iNews.co.uk. I've got George Bellshaw, the tennis writer, and our resident tennis coach, Calvin Betton, with me this evening, talking about all things tennis. I think we're going to move on and talk about the title for Felix Auger-Aliassime in Antwerp this week. He's very much put himself in the frame for a place at the ATP Finals. He's also very much turning himself into the new Andrei Rublev, king of the 250s. George, we've talked a lot about Felix Auger-Aliassime and what we're waiting for him to become. What has he become now?
Well, winning back-to-back titles is always good in my book. No, look, I think if Felix can finish the season inside the top 8 and get to the ATP Finals, then that's a good season. It's. I think sometimes I sort of said this the other week, didn't I? When I can't even remember who we're talking about now. But as a top 10 player, how difficult it can be to kind of move from 10 up to 5 and 5 up to 1, etc. And every place in between becomes difficult, even though we all feel Felix on paper has all the materials to be a guy who could be a top 3 player. It hasn't gone as quickly as maybe we might have liked, but he's still kind of progressing every year. And that's kind of all you can ask from some perspective, is like, what progress have we made this year? Getting to the ATP Finals, doing well at the ATP Finals after a good, strong end to the season, and then carrying that into next season would be another positive step forward for Felix. Obviously, let's hope they're going to be bigger and bigger steps and more obvious steps. But I think you've got to say he is slowly, but surely maybe getting there.
Calvin, we've obviously spoken a lot about Felix on this podcast, and I know you in particular. We gave him a bit of stick for that record of losing 8 finals in a row, and 6 of them were 250s before he finally snapped his duck in Rotterdam earlier this year. He's now won 3 of his last 4 finals, and while I know we were a bit disparaging about the 250s this time of year last week, we have to give him some credit, don't we? For you can only win what's in front of you.
Yeah, he's got better at that. He's got better at closing out the titles, which I always thought was a glitch anyway, because he'd always won them at Challengers, and the mindset doesn't change really. I'm still not sure apart from his belief has got better, I'm still not sure he's much of a better player. I still think the same issues are there. And I think we saw them in the US Open and a little bit in Laver Cup.
We might have this conversation a little bit with the kind of women later, just as looking ahead of the WTA Finals, and this might be another one to really go into on another season. But how many of the men's top 10 are actually better this year. I mean, it's literally Alcaraz, isn't it?
That's a good question, the other one? Yeah.
Casper Ruud probably.
Yeah, Ruud
those two.
Be.
But the rest of them, I wouldn't say have necessarily shown great developmental strides in the right direction.
Well, how many of them are not as good? Medvedev's not as good. Tsitsipas is not as good.
I mean, quite a few of them.
Was good. Nadal.
I mean, Nadal did win the first 2 slams of the year, which is pretty handy.
I guess I'm talking again from Calvin's perspective of are they better at tennis? We can all say Nadal and Djokovic. We don't think they're as good at tennis as they have been, certainly.
Yeah, compared to their best. Yeah, I mean, Zverev was on the road to be better than he was.
Yeah, and that's a very fair point.
And Daniil Medvedev's had half a season as well. Like, he had hernia surgery and he was banned from one of the Grand Slams, so that's definitely got in his way.
But I suppose we do, I'll make this point about the kind of women later as well. We want this environment where the players it's not just about us who we think are the best, but the players who clearly have got the best possible games are getting to that level where they're continually improving and pushing each other. That's what Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, Murray did for years and years and years. That's why the standard of the men's game was so incredibly high for a while. That it's a little bit worrying that some of these careers are stalling in many ways at the moment, and we're not seeing that progression. So I'm hoping that does change soon, because it's an environment, even while we can say on the one hand, great, these guys are sticking around the top 10 and they're filling them up, I still want to see a little bit more kind of from them going forward and pushing on.
Well, you say that there's careers stalling. There must be people moving forward somewhere, and I would suggest that 2 of them have won titles in the last couple of days, i.e. Lorenzo Musetti, who beat Matteo Berrettini in the final of what, it should be said, appears to have been the worst run tournament in history in Naples, where they had to abandon play for the day on several occasions because of humidity, because the courts got too slippery. They couldn't start the tournament on time because they'd only just been painted and there were like ripples in the paint. They had to move venue at one point. You couldn't really stream it anywhere in the world, as far as I could tell, unless you had some specific subscription. I mean, absolute carnage.
Naples is one of my favourite cities in the world, but it's no surprise to me that you say that from the time I visited there. It was just kind of beauty interspersed with absolute chaos and madness and stuff going on. So
Calvin, have you ever had bad paint jobs on a hard court?
I've seen many bad paint jobs on hard courts, but the worst run, I'm not having it, it's the worst run tournament ever. That crown still goes to back in my playing days, the Ripon Junior Open, which used to be run by one bloke over, and it was run, and this was quite unique. There was no other tournament like this. It was run over 3 consecutive weekends. And no matter what, the guy refused to do any scheduling, so he'd just tell everybody in the tournament that they had to turn up at 10 a.m. every day. So even if you were on like last match, he didn't tell you. You just had to turn up at 10 a.m. I remember I turned up once at I'd cottoned on to this after a while and done some educated guessing as to when I was on, and turned up at 12:30 because I thought I'm probably going to play about 3:00. And he ended up giving me a warning and a code violation for turning up late. And on that day, eventually got on at 6:10 at night. And he only ever had one set of balls for each court. So if you got on at 6:10 at night, you were basically playing with potatoes.
Well, that title I see remains with Ripon, but Naples are a brave second. Lorenzo Musetti beat Laszlo Djere, Daniel Galan, Maimek Kekmanovic and Matteo Berrettini in the final. That Berrettini result should just be kind of caveated with the fact that Berrettini's pulled out of Vienna this week with a problem on his left foot. He says he's going to do everything to be ready to compete in Paris, which is obviously only a week away, but more injuries for Matteo Berrettini, not great news.
I'll say that I do hope that they can sort that tournament out, because that would be a real addition to the calendar. It's like we need sort of places like with real character, and Naples, the tournament venue, the stadium, and just the city. I think the way that it's such a sporting city, and I think it would be great if we could have like a really good tournament there every year.
Yeah, and they got the crowds in as well. I was watching the, it wasn't always good, but there were people there watching. I was watching Lorenzo Sonego, who was up against Sebastian Baez, and Baez had to pull out of his service motion on multiple occasions because he was just getting booed.
Yeah, they're absolute animals. I remember Davis Cup there. Britain played Italy in Davis Cup a few years ago, and they basically put a clay court in a coliseum down there, and it was absolute carnage. But it was fantastic. It wasn't, but it was a far cry from the British Davis Cup crowd. I think we can, there was no shouting of "We hope that we will win." Put it that way.
I'm looking for any excuse to go back for Naples, so maybe we could do a Love Tennis podcast trip.
Oh, we'll do a pod trip. Yeah, ideal. Let's see if we can convince some of the Brits to play it. We'll take Evo with us, and Calvin can play doubles with him. There you go. I was also going to mention the fact that Holger Rune won a title this week in Stockholm. Calvin's going to hate me saying it, but there's another feather in the cap for Patrick Muratoglu, who once again starts working with a player and immediately wins a title. Incidentally, talking of great venues for tennis, I've not been to Stockholm, but the Tennis Halla in Stockholm is a spectacular old venue. They've been playing tennis tournaments there since 1946. And I think all the seating is original, and it's kind of wooden benches. It looks very pretty. And Calvin, you can not talk about Muratoglu if you want, but you can talk about Holger Rune because that's a very decent title and a nice little step forward for him. I think he's up to a career high ranking of 25 now.
Yeah, it's a good win for him. He's been on that path for a while. I wouldn't give any of the credit to Muratoglu, really. I don't think that's got anything to do with it. He's been on that pathway. He's been winning decent matches for a while now. Form's been a bit inconsistent recently, but it's another one that Muratoglu's jumped on a bandwagon there. I think. I don't think, yeah.
What I find weird is that, as far as I can tell, he was pretty much working with him before anyway. Yeah. But I suppose now he's full time and he's travelling and the rest of it. To talk about Scandinavia, though, it's something that we've kind of mentioned on the podcast before because, certainly in the 80s, there were a number of top Scandi players, and then we, pretty much since Soderling, I feel like we've kind of been without them.
Yeah, Sweden, there was actually there's a reason for that. Sweden, basically, their tennis used to be funded directly by the Swedish government. It was different from normally you obviously get governing bodies like we have, but tennis I don't know if it's tennis or all sports individually were funded directly from the government. And so that's when they had a lot of players. And around about the late 90s, basically the policy changed and that stopped. So it just lost a load of money, Swedish tennis, going into it from the government. And that's when the huge drop-off in players came. Prior to that, they were probably one of the three biggest nations for tennis. They obviously had Edberg, Borg, Wilander, world number ones repeatedly.
Just on Rune again as well. I mean, looking at his record against Tsitsipas, who he obviously beat in the final, it's 2-0 twice this year, once on clay, once on indoor hard. I mean, that the last thing Tsitsipas needs is another good, talented young player who's got the beating of him already.
I'm not sure whether that's a massive shock, though. If we look at results of if you look on form, then you could probably say Rune maybe is a little bit underranked. He's probably on value for the year. He's a top 20 player. And would you say Tsitsipas is better than the 15th in the world now? 15th best player? I'd say he's in a group that there's not much in them between 6 and 15, 16.
I mean, I appreciate that he lost the final, but he did get to the final. And in Kazakhstan, he also got to the final and lost to Djokovic. And he beat Rublev and Hurkacz, who are top 10 players. So, there are results out there where he has beaten those top players recently. He's so
inconsistent, though, isn't he?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it?
It's like he beats players like Rublev and Hurkacz, but then he can lose to somebody ranked, 70 in the world at any week.
I actually think this is quite instructive as well. If I tell you that Stefanos Tsitsipas has reached the final of his last 3 tour events, which is good, which is a good run by anyone's measure, but he lost in the first round of the US Open. And that I think that says a lot, that our impression is that he's playing, he's not doing it in the big moments. Incidentally, that US Open match was the strangest thing ever. Like, he lost the first 11 games, I think, and he eventually won the third set, but he lost to Daniel Galan, who, with the greatest respect, he should not be losing to. when he's number 4 seed at Grand Slam. We spoke. I mean, if you want to go and listen back to a podcast I think 2 weeks ago called The Sisyphus Dilemma, then please do go back, and I think you'll hear lots of the same things that we say about him then and now, to be quite honest. But congratulations, Holger Rune, 250 title, very valuable, and the same to Lorenzo Musetti, both players I think who we think and want to see more of over the next couple of years. George, you've got a series of questions about Antwerp, but I fear that you're not going to be interested in Belgian beer and rather more interested in Austrian one-handed backhands.
Yeah, I just thought it was nice that you got to see comeback of the AP Tour for next year. Grand Slam champion for a second time to be at a cinema near you in 2022. No, I mean, look, in all seriousness, it's really good for tennis that we're seeing Dominic Thiem start to find his range again. I think, did you speak to him one-on-one, James, or were you just kind of in a few kind of huddles with him, etc.?
No huddles, George. There weren't enough English-speaking journalists for that kind of thing. The huddle was a two-man huddle of me and Dominic. No, we had a good little chat. He was obviously in reasonably high demand, but yeah, we had a chat ahead of his first round match. Incidentally, he did make it to the semis, and he beat Gertz, the Belgian, and then Francisco Cerundolo and Hubert Hurkacz in a very long match, which was very promising. But yeah, we had a bit of a chat and felt like I got a bit of a handle on how he was feeling. He basically said he thinks the backhand, the serve, the movement are all there, like as in back to where they were. He says he's now back in the rhythm of playing matches. I think he said he's played 25 matches since the middle of the year, which is pretty, that's for a guy who's barely played in 2 years. That is, match tightness. We always say it, you can't really replicate it. But he did say, the forehand is good, I can win matches with it, but it's not there. And I suppose, I don't know what people remember or what people think of as, Dominic Thiem's hallmark. I think of him challenging Nadal on clay and getting closer and closer to him. But I also think of that, incredibly potent forehand. It was a stinging forehand. And clearly the wrist problem has taken some of the sting out of that.
I mean, he's got explosive ground strokes off both sides, but explosive movement as well. I mean, when Thiem was at his peak, which actually for me came before he actually won his Grand Slam, that wasn't necessarily his best tournament, but the French Open that year, I mean, the quality of the final with Nadal was brilliant for a few sets. He was really hitting it well. He took Djokovic to a really close one at the Australian Open as well, losing in 5 to him. Thiem's a brilliant player, and he's still, is he 28 now, something like that?
29, I think. But yeah,
and he's a different style to what we've got kind of at the top of the game right now. So I know you guys rib me about it every week, but it's a good thing for tennis if we get this guy back into the top 5. From my perspective, I think he's a great player to watch, and we'll have some good matches with some of these young guys. And I'm not ruling out him getting back up there and winning another one, to be honest.
He's currently 111 in the world, which tells you a lot about how hard he's had to fight to get back.
Yeah, he was in. George alludes to there. He was in his prime. He was the best mover on a tennis court. I'm certain of that. I still have serious doubts whether he's going to the top because he doesn't have the forehand. And you look at where he got to in the top of the men's game. He's tough, and I don't see if it's an injury thing and he's had to change his forehand because of that, which, as I understand, he has. I don't see how he can get it back because it relied on his grip and the wrist, what he could do with his wrist. He might be able to hit a decent forehand, but he's never going to have a forehand that's as good as the one he did have. And I don't think how big a forehand it was, I can't see as he can have a forehand that's anywhere within 20% as good as what he used to have. And if you lose 20% off your forehand, you're struggling.
Yeah, as you always say, Calvin, backhand's the worst weapon in tennis.
Yeah.
I do think it's significant that, Nadal and Djokovic, he was starting to take chunks out of. I think that says a lot about his backhand, because if you're a right-hander against both those players, that's the shot that I think comes under the most pressure, to be honest. Especially on clay against Nadal. But as you say, if he doesn't have if he only has the one punch and not the 1-2 punch, then it's hard to see how he can get back to that level, George.
You'll only find one player with a better clay record against Nadal than Thiem, and that's Djokovic. That's how good he is. Far better than Federer's record.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what I mean. It was such a nice, arc, and the irony is that Thiem has had a double setback, which is that he talked about, he won the US Open and mentally it affected him. He had this huge dip, and then obviously he's had this horrific injury and then a few associated ones.
I think if you look at the closest real comparison, although Thiem's been out for a lot less than Del Potro had, it is Del Potro. And he came back, obviously, and couldn't hit his backhand.
Yeah.
But if he'd have come back and couldn't hit his forehand, he wouldn't have got back in the top 150 in the world. And I think that really is a problem. And I know guys who've been around Thiem the last couple of weeks, and I've been asking them about it, and every one of them has said, everything else looks great, but his forehand, he's not doing the damage on it that he was.
He has got to the top 250. So sorry, 150. 150. So that's even beating your estimates, Calvin. It's going to happen. Don't worry. Maybe he would, in my opinion, be the best player not to win the French Open if he doesn't get back to do that. I don't think you'll find a better.
There's a bit of recency bias there.
No, I seriously think so. Like when you consider Nadal, how good he was, I think as a clay court player.
You think Dominic?
I'm talking about purely French Open.
You think Dominic Thiem's a better player than Pete Sampras?
A better clay court player.
Sampras, just because he didn't win it, he came across like he was pretty good on it. He was better than John McEnroe.
McEnroe should have won it. He bottled it.
Should have won.
Yeah, well avoided.
There's some lovely
little shoulder roll.
All right, I'll go to the last 20 years because I can't speak.
What same guys winning? Same guys winning for 13 of them.
Second best clay court player of the 21st century? No, because Djokovic. Yeah,
Federer's probably the third. I'd say you can even argue on record that Federer's the second best clay court player of the last 20 years.
Djokovic was better than Federer on clay.
Yeah, but then Federer's got real peak Nadal for all of that. How many? If Federer would have come across the Nadal if peak Federer would have come across the Nadal that we've had in the last 5 years, Federer would have more French Opens.
Peak Federer couldn't beat Baby Nadal.
Baby Nadal was chopping up Grand Slams.
I don't we're getting sidetracked. Honestly, this is I neither agree nor disagree with either of you.
How many Frenches has Djokovic got? 2.
Yeah,
I think it's 2. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Let's move on because I want to talk about the WTA and that great draw in Guadalajara this week. We got a final. Well, I don't know if it's a final we expected. George, Sakkari against Pegula. I mean, we all think that Sakkari probably should have been playing these kind of matches a little bit more over the last couple of years and hasn't been. But she got all the way to the final and then was beaten by JPEG, as she's affectionately known, 6-2, 6-3 in a fairly one-sided final. But it meant that we now have the lineup for the WTA Finals settled. It's Świątek Jabeur, Pegula Goff, Sakkari Garcia, and Sabalenka Kasatkina in ranking order. George, I think it's quite weird to be talking about Maria Sakkari in the WTA Finals because I feel like she's had an absolutely rotten year.
Yeah. She's had a very up and down year is how I'd kind of describe it. She had a final, didn't she, a few weeks ago as well, but I think she's lost first round, the 2 tournaments in between that final and this one. But look, there's a lack of top players at the top of the WTA rankings at the minute. Look, let's not beat around the bush here. If you look at I know the points are slightly different between the men's and the women's, but if you look at the totals that people are putting together, they're not great, to be honest. We're really lacking consistency at the top of the game. And I take Jabeur out of that. I take, obviously, Świątek. Świątek's uber consistent, brilliant. And I'd have Pegula out of that list as well, because she's had a really good year, been really consistent. But for me, as good as Pegula's been this year, and as much as I like her, and as much as I think she can challenge for slams in the future, she's this level of player who should be on the brinks of qualifying for the WTA final, in my opinion, somewhere between 6 and 10 in the world. You know, there are good players out there who aren't really flying to the top of that ranking list at the minute. And that, you know, made similar comments about the men earlier about them not kicking on, but the women's issue is a lot bigger because they're not even staying in the top 10 at the moment. And that's a big problem. So hopefully that changes. And I'll be more positive to finish on this note. I think Pegula's fantastic, and I really, really like her. And I have been uber impressed with her all year. You know, I picked her to beat Swiatek at the US Open this year. I thought that's how good I think she is. I think she's been very level-headed, turned up to a lot of big events. Every event I see Pegula's name, and I think Pegula can go and win this tournament. And I hope she carries that on into next year, because it's always good to have consistent players at the top of the game, and that's why I'm groaning otherwise.
I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but is Jessica Pegula an interesting story?
Not necessarily, but you still need good, consistent players playing each other often, and that's where we've really lacked this year. You know, who the hell is Swiatek's rival at the minute? Tell me.
Well, no, I don't mean...
And that's an issue.
I don't mean it's bad for tennis to have JPEG up there. What I mean is, I'm you know,
it's not as good as Goff, for example, being up there.
But albeit, is it, you know, for people who don't know, she's the daughter of the Pegulas who own the Buffalo Bills football team and the Buffalo Sabres hockey team. I feel like she always gets that thrown at her as a dig. Like, as a, oh, you're just a rich kid. But, like, you know, she's also, like, number 5 in the world, so she's not just a rich kid. As you say, Goff is a better story. You know, you have a go at players who are not being consistently in top 10, but Coco Gauff's at a career-high ranking now, as of yesterday, and I think qualifies 4th for the WTA Finals. So, you know, you have to say...
I'm not digging out Goff because, you know, she's 18 and still coming on, and this is good. I still think she could be doing better in many ways, given how good she is. But I mean, look, you know some of the people I'm digging out. I don't need to reel them all off.
Arina Sabalenka, is that who you mean?
Well, you know, I'd like to see Osaka back up there, obviously, and you know, you can talk about problems off the court and all that, but the reality is, on the court has been poor. That's the sort of player we kind of want up there. I'd like to see Anisimova really cracking on and getting back towards the top 20. I think people this year have gone up last year and dropped down. You know, Badosa last year looked like she was going to be a player who could be really interesting and kicking around up there. It just hasn't happened. And we're kind of left with people like, you know, Garcia has spent the entirety of her career not making the most of her talents. She's popped in at world number 6 this year. Is she going to be there next year? Would you back Caroline Garcia to stick around? I hope she does. But every season, we're left with a top 10 of just random people. Kudermetova, who on earth would have had her top 10 at the end of this year? You know, good player. But you know, the men's, the 6 to 8 players in the men's have probably been there for the last 3 or 4 years. That's the difference.
Do you know how many of this year's WTA finalists were at the WTA Finals last year?
Sakkari and Swiatek. Did Goff make it? I don't know. Did
Goff didn't make it.
Did Jabeur?
I don't know how many it is, but we had the discussion on it a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? That how many? I think there's only one.
Sabalenka.
There's only one Grand Slam. Only one of the players there has won a Grand Slam in the last 3 years.
Yeah. I'm just looking at it. I mean, only one of the players there has won a Grand Slam ever.
Ever, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a concern.
Yeah. I mean,
it's 4, isn't it?
It's It's 3, isn't it? Sabalenka, Sakkari, and Swiatek.
Oh yes, 3. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, here's a question then. Of these 8, and I remind you, it's Swiatek, Jabeur, Pegula, Goff, Sakkari, Garcia, Sabalenka, Kasatkina. How many do we think will be in the WTA Finals next year? Swiatek, I think we all agree, surely.
Goff will.
Swiatek, Goff. I hope Pegula will be.
Sabalenka tends to churn out.
Jabeur, we should really. I mean, I can't decide if Jabeur's just had a really good year. We'll dip again next year as other players kind of start powering her out.
So
but
she'd
probably be
dips,
8.
If she dips, she's going to dip to like 8 or something. Like, she's not going to
She'll be there or thereabouts.
I mean, then it depends on things like, is Osaka ever going to play more than 5 tournaments a year again? Or
I think Daria Kasatkina. I think that might be controversial, but I've been really impressed, given everything that she's been through this year as well. To play the way she has was really impressive.
For all the criticism you can have of Sabalenka, she is typically up there. She's probably been the most consistent player in the top 8 for years. I mean, she needs to do better at the slams, but I can't really have a go at her for making it this far every year. So people will probably say I'm being a bit harsh here, James. So I do like all the players who are there. I do hasten to add that, but it's just I just want to see a bit more consistency and big matches happening again and again where we can get excited about it. Get Krejcikova back up there as well. You know, just feels like a lot of the players who should be top 5 or top 10 at the minute aren't, and I think that's a shame.
Yeah, I to be honest, I really like this top 8. Like, I look at each one of those players. I know what I said about Pegula, and maybe that is the one that stands out. But I think all of those players, kind of, I'm interested in one way or another. But yeah, as you say, George, I hope they're all there next year. All 8 again would be great. Now, we're going to move on because I've been a very busy bee, as has been discussed. And what you're going to hear next is an interview with a chap called Cosman from Romania, who got in touch with me because he is making a film about tennis parents, or at least he would like to make a film, and he needs your help. If you look in the description, I have put a link to a Kickstarter, and here's why you should be clicking on it.
At the age of 3, my parents took me to the tennis course because my dad was always passionate about tennis. And, you know, the cliche story, like the kid who goes to the tennis courts, likes the tennis, likes the courts, likes the rackets. He finds it fun. And from that on, I started getting into trainings, by the age of 4 or 5. I started practicing a few times a week. And it got serious because my dad actually wanted me to get involved in tennis, try to become someone. And for many years, it was actually my dream to become one of the best players in the world. I know everybody wants this. And again, very passionate about tennis, but let's say I started competing professionally at 10 years old, national tournaments and stuff, and I was pretty good at that age. I mean, if I remember correctly, I was in the first 20 players in Romania, but things started getting harder and harder because, you know, at that age you start fitness training, you start looking for professional coaches, because I was actually coached by my dad until 14 years old. You know, because he was into it and he kind of liked it. And
did he play himself in his younger days? Did he play to a decent level?
He played tennis, actually. I don't think he played let's say, professional senior tennis, but he played decently. I mean, I don't know if it was the good decision to coach me, but as I was a kid, it wasn't my saying in this.
So you got into your teenage years, you're playing at quite a high level. You're obviously not a tennis player now. What went wrong? Did you just reach a level where you weren't necessarily good enough, or did you turn away from it on your own accord?
Well, at the age of 17, 18, I realized I was watching all these players on the tour, and I realized, wow, that's a lot of work. Of course, obviously it is a lot of work, but at that age you are looking for results, or at least I was looking for some decent results, not just national tournaments, because nobody cares about them. You have to go play international, you have to get some results at ITFs or I don't know, futures tournaments. And I saw the level, I had to be honest with myself, actually, because it was a hard decision for me. Of course, I've been playing for 15 years and I was I don't know what to do from now on. I don't know anything else. I don't have any particular skill. And I had to think like, okay, if I'm doing this, what should I do? How can I break into, let's say, okay, not top 50 ATP, but at least top 200?
Mm-hmm.
And one day I was like, okay, I can do this. It's such a tough life. It's in the meantime, from 13 years old or 14 years old, I picked up the camera and somehow it felt native, like it was part of myself, because no one in my family actually has this creative side.
Mm.
But somehow I picked up the camera and I always wanted to shoot stuff, to make short films, even though they were pretty stupid, of course. But and time passed, and at 15 years old, I met my second coach, because I actually had like two tennis coaches, and one of them was actually a graduate of the National Cinematography School.
Oh, really?
And for me, of course, it was very interesting to hear his story, to hear the background, to hear, because he actually was a professional tennis player too. He even got like 1 ATP point.
Right, okay.
And I was very fascinated more about his cinema background than his tennis background.
I see. So when you turned away from tennis and got into filmmaking, I guess that's where it kind of brings us to the film that you're trying to make now, which is, well, I read you said you encountered a lot of self-centered and narcissistic parents, and that's kind of what's driven you to try and make this film. Can you talk to us a bit about some of the worst examples of the kind of nightmare tennis parent that you came across, and the ones that really like you remember very well?
Unfortunately, I remember too much. I mean, I've seen awful stuff. For example, I have one that's on top of my mind. I was playing actually at a tournament in Bucharest, and I was playing this guy we met like 100 times before we knew each other. Our families knew each other. And it happened that like me to beat him. And of course, as kids, you don't pay like too much attention who wins. You are just friends playing tennis. And after the match, I saw him get beat by his father, like, but not just beaten, like his father threw him on the ground and started kicking him with his legs. And it was like, for me, it was an eye opener, because you see that at every tournament. And it's not just a Romanian thing, it's like a universal thing. I saw like every match, every tournament, every practice, I saw parents pushing their kids, not giving a single F word about their happiness, about they really like tennis, or they like tennis just because they want to like tennis. And parents really, really forget that sports are meant to be fun, no matter what. I mean, just imagine Federer, Rafa, Djokovic, they are all having fun on the court. Because if they weren't having fun, they wouldn't be playing.
A lot of this seems to come up in at the highest level when we hear about it, and I don't know. I've been quite encouraged recently by a couple of pros coming out and talking about their experiences. I know Pam Shriver's talking about it, Jelena Jokic as well, who I'm sure you've come across, and Fiona Ferro has an ongoing case actually, which is really concerning. Does it give you any hope that players are more willing to talk about this stuff, that your film can be part of a kind of movement to crack down on this and to make parents more aware of the pitfalls they can kind of come across?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it really helps that we're living these days where everybody's coming out, saying stuff, saying what happened, because usually it gets buried down and nobody talks about, because they're, I don't know, maybe they're afraid or something. And if we do this movie, if other players start to talk about it, if the media talks about it, maybe someday, like in 10 years or so, it will get much better, because a lot of careers end before they even begin due to these parents pushing their kids. And it's not just like traumatizing the kids, it's like at 18 years old, when the kids become young adults, they want to like go to parties, have friends, because of course sports life is not the best life, if you know what I mean. I mean, it is the best life. You don't see it that way when you actually play and do stuff, because of course you have friends there, but your circle is pretty limited.
It's not so often. Calvin says this on the podcast that like tennis players don't know anything outside of tennis, and I think it's exactly as you say. When you're inside that bubble, it's fine, and then sometimes when you just come out of the bubble for a second and you look around, you go, oh my god, there's so much more world, kind of Truman Show style. In that context, tell us a bit about the film. I mean, it's called Out, which I guess is an appropriate word given what we were just talking about. It's based on a true story, I think I'm right in saying. Tell us a bit about, is it Clara's story?
Well, Clara's story is actually a lot of people's stories put together into one character, because it's actually everything that I've seen, I lived, I heard about it, and there are a lot of stuff. And we somehow designed this script to take you, it's a short film, and it will be like 20 minutes long. And we wanted like to compress all my memories, all the things I've seen, experienced into 20 minutes. And to like, for someone, we didn't want to make this film only for tennis passionates. We wanted this film to be like, to appeal the broader audiences. And somehow we take you from a practice and you get to experience a weekend in Clara's life, and you get to see that everything revolves around tennis. Everything from family's dinner to the mornings to the practices, everything is about tennis.
And I suppose one thing that jumped out to me, and part of some of the names that I mentioned, is that this is a film about a young girl. Now, you're obviously a man, and we're a boy growing up playing tennis. Do you think that this stuff happens more to girls than it does to boys for any variety of reasons?
Well, in my opinion, it happens to both of the genders equally, but the thing is, boys tend to be less affected by this. Of course, we are equal to each other. I don't want to sound like...
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I suppose often girls mature in different ways. I guess that's fair to say. Like, so I remember being 13 years old at school, and I got moved into a higher year group for some academic stuff, and all of the girls were like 1.5 feet taller than me, and it was incredibly weird and terrifying. But I suppose for whatever reason, they also mature at different rates emotionally. I mean, Calvin would always say that boys and girls are all different, every single one is different, but there's certainly evidence to suggest that girls end up being manipulated by coaches more than boys do, it seems, or at least for want of a better phrase, coaches have more success manipulating girls than they do boys, which I guess is maybe why it made sense to have a female protagonist in your film.
Yeah, even though we didn't want to like use this subject about sexual abuse, because it is like a big issue, but somehow I don't have like experience on this, and I didn't want to make a movie just for the sake of it. I really wanted to put my heart in it and not show stuff I didn't see or live
or have lived experience of. That's
exactly.
So I think I'm right in saying you're trying to raise $42,000. Is that right? Can you just, people I'm sure will want to help, of course, and take part in the project. Can you tell them a bit about what that money will go towards? Like, what are the big costs? I don't know how to make a film. I don't know what the costs are.
Yeah, of course. Well, from that 42K, I think 10K, or at least that's what we know, will go to the fulfillment of the rewards, to manufacturing them or buy them, of course, because we designed this campaign to be for tennis passionates, but also for the broader audiences. You can get like signed tennis balls by us. You can get a copy of the script signed by us. You can get the link to watch the movie. You can also be credited if you want as an associate producer or executive producer. The rest of the budget will go towards making this movie, because a lot of people don't know how expensive it actually is to make the movie. Because imagine you have to pay locations, you have to pay the crew, you have to pay for insurance for the crew, and so on. You have to like rent the cameras, there are a lot of things to rent, there are a lot of things to pay for, of course. So it's not about the profit. There will be no profit in this movie, because many people don't know short films are not made for profit, are just made for
love.
For love, for experience, for what you want, but no money. So it's not about the money. It's really, we wanted like to raise awareness as much as possible on this, because for many years I was so like, write about what you know, and I was like skeptical. I was thinking, no, I want to make fiction films, I want to make this or that, and you realize at some point you don't really have experience with that stuff. And there are stories you can share with the world which are unique, which are like more authentic.
Okay, that's interesting. And just finally, what would you really love this film to achieve, apart from creating something? And you know, I'm a writer and a broadcaster. I understand the value of creating something for its own sake, but is there something you would, if I could say to you in 5 years' time, this film achieved X or Y, what would you like to achieve from it?
Really, we would be thrilled if we could hear like one parent changed their mind about how are they treating their children. So if there are parents who will watch this movie and they will be like, oh, I'm doing that, oh, I'm doing that too, and after the film they can say, okay, maybe it's not the right thing, maybe I need to work on myself. Because parents, as much as they love their children, can hurt their children like a lot. In this process of creating this campaign, we talked to many people and actually found out that a lot of them went through this story in some way or another. We have like somebody who played rugby. He's from Ireland, and he told us, whoa, are you making this movie? Because look, this happened to me. I was playing rugby, and you know, so if people can change their minds about how they are treating their children, it would be great.
Cosmin Andrea there. The film is called Out. If you want to contribute towards the Kickstarter, the link is in the description to the podcast. I'll also stick something on our Twitter. Tennis parents. It's a tough subject, Calvin, and you know, Cosmin's testimony there is, some of it is very disturbing. You know, talking about parents physically abusing kids after tennis matches, and I think he would argue that it ranges from, you know, quite low-level psychological abuse to this very serious physical abuse. But you know, clearly being a tennis parent is not an easy job. You have to be incredibly driven to do it successfully.
Yeah, you've got to be extremely driven, and you've got to take you've got to sacrifice a lot in your life if you want your kids to be elite level tennis players. And it takes a certain type of mindset to do that. I will say it's a really interesting interview. I listened to it earlier. And I've never, in all the years I've coached, I've never seen any player physically abused by their parents. So I will say that I don't think that's not in this country. I don't think that's regular, and it's not something I've heard of either in the UK. But I'm certain it goes off abroad.
And what about the kind of, you know, what you might call the more low level, and what you might not even call abuse, but the way parents treat their kids? Because as far as I can tell, there are a lot of parents out there who play tennis to a certain level, but never quite good enough. And it's the cliche almost, isn't it? They're trying to live vicariously through their kids. You must see a fair bit of that.
I mean, you do. And the one thing I always find strange with this is that once the players get to, say, a certain age, once they get past, you know, 9 or 10, and the players are even semi-decent, what cracks me up, one thing that's always cracks me up, is that parents of these people, some of these people have never played tennis in their lives, and they're giving tactical and technical advice and telling their kids how they should have played. And I stand there watching and think, well, they already know more about tennis than you ever will. Like they're already, they've played better. They've actually struck a ball. They've played a match. They know way more how to play a tennis match and the tactics of a tennis match than their parents do, just by the basis that they've actually played the sport. But that doesn't stop parents still thinking that they know more than their kids about tennis. And it's abuse in inverted commas comes in many different formats and on many different ways. And I know one of the better players who I coached, a girl she was British #1, but her mum was very demanding, but she never abused her daughter. She was quite the opposite. She was always very defensive of her and this kind of thing. But I know the girl I'm talking about once said to me, like, we were on a car journey somewhere, and she said the thing what bothered her most was that it was all her mum ever talked about was tennis. And she just wanted a break to just not talk about tennis. She'd bring her to tennis, and all the way there she was talking about tennis. All the way they'd leave and she was talking about tennis, and over dinner she'd talk about tennis. And she said that, like, and the girl was actually, like, as she got older, she said, I actually enjoy tennis. I always thought she didn't enjoy tennis. She said, I actually enjoy tennis. I enjoy playing tennis, enjoy playing matches, but it's all I ever get. And I think that's something that a lot of kids experience.
I was going to say, I was going to ask you, maybe you've answered the question already, but maybe there are other things. If you're a tennis parent listening to this podcast and you could give them one piece of advice, apart from maybe what you said about, not always talking tennis or not being too involved, are there other things parents can do to kind of make it better and make it work?
Yeah, understand their limitations of what they know. They don't know very much about tennis at all, as I wouldn't know much about their jobs or that kind of thing. And, their kids probably know more about tennis than they do. And unless you specifically know why you're talking about something, then don't talk about it with your kids, because it can be problematic. But also, and I know this is difficult, look, and most parents, I'll say this as well, and I think any coach would say this, 90% of the parents we deal with are just really good people. They're not, and even if they are a bit over-enthusiastic, some of the worst tennis parents I've come across, and I say the worst, like I say, I've never come across physical or even mental abuse, really, just over-keenness. Some of the ones that you'd say are nutty, outside of that, are some of the soundest people that you could ever come across. Really good. And also, I'll say this, outside of being a bit obsessed with tennis, some of the best parents that I've ever come across as well.
George, what do you make of it? I mean, you've obviously come at it from the other side, but we all know lots of parents within the professional game. There are still lots of them around.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this kind of conversation between us for a long time, haven't we, about kind of the demands of top-level sport, and particularly top-level individual sport like tennis. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that to make it as a elite-level tennis player, you need to commit to this sport from a pretty bloody young age, and that requires someone really to be pushing a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old, 10-year-old to keep going, and probably when they don't want to. I've not got as extensive experience of Calvin of experiencing parents, but even at my days playing as kind of a good young player at a club who'd quite often hit with younger players, parents would ask me, would you come and hit with my son, just so they can get some hitting practice against someone who's tall, who they'll be comfortably better than in a few years' time, but for now you'll do, sort of thing. You see even then the dynamic, and I played a few matches with a few kind of juniors coming through who were younger and playing adult tennis for the first time, kind of club doubles, and having strops and, saying, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm sick of it. And, there is a kind of constant tension that's really coming, because it's a horrible sport as well. Again, not playing it to the top level, but I've played enough matches and lost enough matches, it's really bloody frustrating. Like, I'm good at it and I hate it half the time. And to get to the top level, you're losing so many matches, you're playing brilliant matches, and you put your entire life into it. You've got your parents kind of putting their entire life to it in some cases. You talk about Osaka's parents or the Williams sisters' parents. It is a stressful environment as well. So obviously this is an extreme. I'm not excusing anyone's behavior in this documentary, etc., but it is a fraught environment and a tough thing to kind of find balance is the wrong word because I'm not trying to condone it, but you know what I mean. You need that kind of element of someone pushing you along, but also there's got to be boundaries and there's got to be good safeguarding going on as well.
I think something that I should say about it from my experience as well, that I think sometimes parents can get a bit of a bad rep, and I think it's important to see it from this way, and now there's different layers to this as well, is that, I'll give a specific example that I'm currently seeing quite a bit of right now, but I've experienced this quite a bit over the years as well, is that the parents, they're often just looking out for their kids, and they've seen things in their kids that as teenagers you can see it going the wrong way. And I'm saying this because I know of a parent now who's very keen, and you could say pushy, but nothing serious, nothing that would result in any type of harm. They're just very keen on their tennis, but the child of this parent is on a route that if he doesn't do anything in tennis, I think he's not on a particularly good route to the rest of his life. And I think his parents know that, and they're aware of that, and they think that we need him to go somewhere with the tennis, whether that even be professionally or just going to getting a university scholarship and that kind of thing. Otherwise, this is not going to be a real great path that he's going to take. And I think that happens a lot. They are looking out for their kids. And if parents behaved with schooling as they often did with tennis, if they forced their kids to do schoolwork, then we wouldn't look on it in a bad way or that kind of thing. But because it's a sport, we kind of frown upon it. And they do just want, most of the time, their kids to have a decent life, whether that be being a professional tennis player or where tennis may lead to that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, it's always the balancing act, is that sport can be an incredibly powerful tool. And, we Calvin, I know you hate it when people talk about tennis as a posh sport. It's not. It's, there's plenty of people out there for whom tennis has provided an outlet, and, who come from pretty humble backgrounds. Yeah,
and look, there's no blueprint for this. There's not a pathway that everyone follows. Sometimes kids get more interested in tennis when they get a little bit older. And, if you'd have told me at 13, 14 that I'd still be involved in tennis now, I'd have thought, don't be silly. I'm not even that bothered about it. I'd rather play football. I'd rather play guitar. But around about the age of 17, 18, I became really into my tennis. And that was, to be honest, my parents, if they weren't pushy at all. They never really wanted me to be a tennis player, but they were insistent that I keep playing tennis and that kind of thing. So I think it's a lot on that. It's all right going, oh, they're pushy, but like I say, they know their kids, and they might think, they're not doing particularly well at school. They don't have any real interest. And I think especially nowadays, that's a thing where you look at, and I see a lot of kids now, and you think, well, you'll hear the coaches or the parents go like, they're not really into it. And you think, what are they into? It's not like they're into it, they just want to sort of bum around, I guess. And parents are not going to see their kids do that. So I think as long as there's no sort of physical or mental abuse, the pushiness has never really led to anything bad in my experience.
I think what was interesting is I chatted to someone who has worked on WTA quite a lot over the years, and we were talking about tennis parents, and he said, yeah, it is hard, and very few players make it without some kind of tennis background. But what he said was that actually that some of the best parents are the ones who've come from like a high level athletic background and understand what it takes to be a successful athlete, but not within tennis itself. And they know when to kind of step back and, as you say, Calvin, let the people who know what they're talking about do their work.
It's funny you say that, James, because I was actually saying at the very top level, there were many parents who kind of helped their kids get there, but then know just to step the hell out the way. The worst ones are the ones who just keep hanging around, keep trying to be involved all the time. We've kind of spoken about that with Sisyphus a little bit. Quite often the case is that the ones you see less are they will have been involved at younger ages, but they know the time and place to let go. And that's kind of, again, keeping yourself removed enough to kind of give the right decision for your kids.
Look, I've seen it the other way as well. I've seen kids who are really good. I've coached a kid before who was very, very good, and he was into his sport, and his parents were great people, really great people, successful people, really successful in both their lines of work. They just weren't that into tennis, and he could have been a serious player. but his dad loved his rugby, and he wanted his lad to be, and wasn't pushy with the rugby at all. And I think now he's probably gonna, from what I hear, he's probably gonna end up playing for England at rugby. But and I'm thinking all the time, I wish they were a little bit more pushy. But they'd go like, you go, any chance you could get to a tournament this weekend? Well, nearest one's like Hull, and it's a bit far, and it's an hour. It's not that far, but so it goes both ways. It's just a case of finding a happy medium, and you're never going to get a perfect parent, or you rarely do.
And if you've got some interesting stories about your time as a tennis parent, or maybe you were coached by your parents growing up, we'd love to hear from you. You can drop us an email at lovetennispod@gmail.com, or you can let us know on Twitter, of course, at lovetennispod. We had some good engagement this week, #engagement, on the George's What Are You Top 10 At in the World. I received some congratulations on being the top 10 at my commute. We've had a few different people. Jake Davies, who's a tennis writer I've been getting to know recently, he says he's top 10 in the world at drinking a cappuccino. I wasn't clear whether that was speed or style. Sarah Evans saying definitely top 10 at untying knots, like the ones you really think you have no hope. That's an incredibly useful skill, and I think that should be marketable in one way or another. Also had an email from someone who has asked to remain anonymous. Says, I myself am the uncontested world number 1 in managing my wife's emotions, and I have a longer career than Jimmy Connors, as there are not 9 other people out there that could handle staying in this event. As I say, remains anonymous, probably sensible for the ongoing status of their marriage. You can get in touch however you want. Email, Twitter, Facebook. We always like hearing from you. George, I'm going to throw any other business in your direction. We've gone on long enough tonight, but I feel like you may have more.
That's been long. I think just a couple of injury hits, wasn't it? Zverev, that season seems to be over. Similar for Kyrgios, and I don't think we actually said this earlier in the bit about Draper, but he did leapfrog Murray in the rankings, didn't he? I think this week, which British number 3, another little milestone for him.
Yes, very much so. I have an interview with him in the works, which will be coming out in the next week or two. We chat about sorts of things.
Did sadly lose to Alcaraz the 7-5 in the third. So.
Yeah, I mean, took a set off him. Decent effort.
It's pretty good. Good effort.
Not bad, given that Mr. Alcaraz can play a bit. Just on the Kyrgios thing, I mean, I don't think it's injury. I know he's pulled out of Basel and Paris, and presumably that means he won't play the World Tour Finals with Kokkinakis either, where I'm pretty sure he will have qualified on the grounds that he's a Grand Slam champion, and therefore you only have to be in the top 20. I don't know if anyone can challenge me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. Anyway, I think it's academic, because I think the fact that he's not playing these 2 tournaments in Europe means he's not coming to Europe. And I saw a thing on his Instagram yesterday which just said, AO, I'm coming for you, or something along those lines, i.e. Australian Open, which I think is probably his focus now. It's very about the Davis Cup. That injury clearly just sticking with him. I think that is everything from us this week. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for leaving us reviews and ratings and following us on Twitter and the rest of it. As always, please make sure you come back next week.
Sports Social Podcast Network.